Thanks everybody for coming this evening. My quest for the truths and mysteries of the Knights Templar started before I even became a Freemason in 2012. My fascination with the subject led me to put this knowledge into a cohesive report over the course of several years. My information came from a wide variety of sources, including several books, documentaries, and different online resources. As we all know, much of what we know about the Knights Templar are myths and legends, and here I try to connect those legends with historical facts. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, commonly known as the Knights Templar, the Order of the Temple, or simply the Templars, were among the most wealthy and powerful of the Western Christian military orders. The organization existed for nearly 2 centuries during the Middle Ages. The stories and origins surrounding the Templars date back to the Old Testament in the building of King Solomon's Temple. The construction of Solomon's Temple began around 958 BC on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem under King Solomon, and the construction lasted until about 951 BC. We are told in the Book of Kings that in plan the temple was a rectangular oriented east and west and measuring 60 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. A cubit is generally taken to be about a half a meter or half a yard. So the Temple of Solomon was about 30 yards long, 10 yards wide, and 15 yards high. What was most impressive about the temple, apart from its sanctity, were its costly and finely worked materials and decorations, for which these Solomon relied on his friend and ally King Hiram of Tyre. The most remarkable of all the work done at Solomon's temple was the casting of the enormous basin known as the Sea of Bronze and both of the huge bronze pillars known as Jachin and Boaz. The man sent by King Hiram to undertake the work was a man filled with wisdom and understanding. He too was called Hiram, and he is described as the widow's son. The 2 hollow bronze pillars, each 18 cubits or 9 yards high, were placed on either side of the entrance porch. The pillars were surmounted with capitals 5 cubits high and of elaborate design, opening out into lotus or lily forms adorned with garlands or pomegranates. Hiram, the widow's son, gave them each a name, calling the one on the south side of the porch Jachin, meaning he shall establish, and the one on the north side Boaz, meaning in its strength. The 2 names were most likely meant to read together as something like he shall establish in its strength. When the Assyrians captured Jerusalem in 587 BC, they destroyed the city and burnt down Solomon's temple, sending the population into exile in Babylon. As told in the book of Ezra, after the Assyrians were overthrown by the Persians, the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, gave permission for the Jews to return home and rebuild the Temple of Solomon. After 5 centuries of wear and decay under King Herod, Solomon's temple was enlarged and refurbished on a grand scale, which resulted in the 3rd version of the Great Temple. The end of the temple came during the first Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 AD, when Titus, the Roman emperor, finally put down the insurrection in 70 AD. The temple was accidentally destroyed by fire. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade, which was a military expedition by Roman Catholic Europe to regain the Holy Lands taken in the Muslim conquests, resulting in the recapture of Jerusalem in 1099. Pope Urban named Admir, the Bishop of Lisieux, as his representative on the expedition as its spiritual leader. Following Admir's example, everyone joining the expedition had a cross of red material sewn onto the corner of his coat, symbolizing that, like Jesus, they too carried a cross. Urban had launched a movement greater than he knew, and in the belief that the apocalypse was at hand, thousands of peasants, artisans, and other ordinary people, often very poor, took the cross for the eastward march to liberate the Holy Land. Of all those who set out, only 1 in 20 would live to see Jerusalem. 2 days after the reconquest of Jerusalem on July 17, 1099, the Crusader barons met to choose a new leader. The crown was offered to Godfrey of Bouillon, but within a year Godfrey was dead and the crown passed to his brother, who ruled over the kingdom of Jerusalem as Baldwin I. For his palace he used the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was assumed to stand on the site of Solomon's temple. Christian pilgrims who traveled to visit what they were referred to as the holy places were routinely slaughtered, sometimes by the hundreds, as they attempted to make the journey from the coastline into the Holy Land. The formation of the Templars arose out of these conditions of insecurity on the roads. A group of 9 French knights, most prominently Hugh of Payens, a knight from the Champagne region who had fought in the First Crusade, and Godfrey of St. Omer, had proposed to the Patriarch of Jerusalem and King Baldwin II, who had succeeded his cousin in 1118, that for the salvation of their souls, they form a community or perhaps even withdraw into the contemplative life of a monastery. Instead, Baldwin persuaded Hugh of Payens and his companions to save their souls by protecting pilgrims on the road to the Holy Land. They were to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but were also to defend pilgrims against bandits. On Christmas Day, 1119, Hugh and his companions took their vows before the Patriarch in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, calling themselves in Latin the Pauperes Commilitones Christi, or the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The knights started to receive a modest income from the Count of Anjou, French nobles, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Though the knights were still relatively poor, they had no distinctive uniforms at the time. Their seals alluded to this brotherhood in poverty by depicting two knights, perhaps Hugh of Payens and Godfrey of St. Omer, having to share a single horse. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave the poor fellow soldiers the Alaqua Mosque, which had been his previous palace, as their new headquarters. They used it to store arms, clothing, and food while stabling their horses in the great underground vault at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. As the vaults were thought to have been Solomon's stables and the Alaqua Mosque was believed to have been built on the site of Solomon's temple. It was not long before the knights had encompassed the association in their name. They became known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or in a word, the Templars. Grants of land as well as silver, horses, and armor were given to the Templars almost as soon as Grand Master Hugh of Payens landed in France in the atrium in the autumn of 1127. The following summer, the Grand Master was in England, where he had received with great honor by King Henry I, who donated gold and silver to the order. More donations followed when Hugh traveled north to Scotland. In September, Hugh of Payens had returned across the Channel, where he was met by Godfrey of St. Omer, and together they received further grants and treasures. All these given in defense for the Holy Land and for the salvation of their donors' souls. The Templars were to renounce their wills, to hold worldly matters cheap, and to not be afraid to fight, but always be prepared for death, and for the crown of salvation and eternal life. The knights were to dress in white, symbolizing that they had put the dark life behind them, and had entered into a state of chastity. Foul language and displays of anger were forbidden, as were reminiscences of past sexual conquests. Discipline was enforced by a system of penances, with expulsion being the punishment in extreme cases. Hugh of Payens died in 1136, and his successor was Robert of Crayon, the second Grand Master. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued Omne Datum Optimum, which had the effect of establishing the Templars as an independent and permanent order within the Catholic Church, answerable to no one but the Pope, and sanctioned their role as defenders of the Church and attackers of the enemies of Christ. The Grand Master was to be chosen from among the ranks of the Templar Knights, free from outside interference. All spoils of battle against the infidels were theirs by right, and donations made to the Templars were put under the protection of the Holy See, or the jurisdiction of the Pope. Bernard de Clairvaux and Hugh de Payens devised a specific code of behavior for which the Templar order, known to its modern historians as Latin Rule. It consisted of 72 clauses that defined the ideal behavior for the knights, such as the type of garments they were to wear and how many horses they could have. As the order grew, more guidelines were added. The original list of 72 clauses was expanded to several hundred in its final form. Initiation, known as reception into the order, was a profound commitment and involved a solemn ceremony. Outsiders were discouraged from attending the ceremony, which aroused the suspicions of medieval inquisitors during the later trials. New members had to willingly sign over all their wealth and goods to the order and take vows of poverty, chastity, piety, and obedience. The growing importance of the Templars can be measured by the fact that on April 27, 1147, King Louis VII and Pope Eugenius III came to the Paris Temple, which had become the European headquarters of the order, to discuss plans for the Second Crusade. Also in attendance were 4 archbishops and 130 Templar knights, with at least as many sergeants and squires. Here it was agreed that the Templars would accompany the French army to the east. It is also said that on this occasion, the Pope conferred on the Templars the right to emblazon and wear their famous habit of a red cross over a white tunic, symbolizing their readiness to suffer martyrdom in defense of the Holy Land. From their formation during the First Crusade, the Templars started building castles throughout Europe. They served as residence and administrative centers, as well as having a military function. But after the Second Crusade, the military nature of the castles became more important. They were often large and elaborate and continuously improved by the latest innovations in military sciences. In all, over 50 castles were built. With their military mission and extensive financial resources, the Knights Templar funded a large number of building projects around Europe and the Holy Land, many of which structures remain standing today. Numerous buildings and castles were built in the Middle East, France, Portugal, Italy, Spain, England, Scotland, Ireland, Croatia, and other countries as well. The Templars became Europe's first bankers, a development unintended and unforeseen, yet one that arose naturally out of their situation. From their beginning, the Templars were an international organization. Their purpose was in the Holy Land, but their support came from Europe, where they held land and received donations from the pious. They organized markets and fairs, managed their estates, and traded in everything from wool and timber to olive oil and slaves. In time, they built up their own formidable Mediterranean merchant fleet, capable of transporting pilgrims, soldiers, and supplies between Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and Outremer, which were at the time the Crusader states. Disciplined, honest, and independent, the Templars were trusted throughout medieval society, and their experience in commerce and finance made them the ideal bankers to popes and kings. Yet, in their successes as bankers and financiers lay a chief cause of their fall. The Templars developed a system of credit notes whereby money deposited in one Templar location could be withdrawn at another upon production of the note, a procedure that required the meticulous and honest record-keeping at which they excelled. An obvious extension to guarding crusaders, documents, and money was to make funds available during the expeditions themselves. The Templars operated treasure ships offshore from which the campaigning knights, nobles, and kings could make emergency withdrawals. The Templars also provided loans, for example, to Louis VII, the King of France, during the Second Crusade. This was the beginning of the Templars' close financial association with the French monarchy, effectively becoming its downfall. In the mid-12th century, the tide began to turn in the Crusades. The Muslim world had become more effective and more united under effective leaders such as Saladin, and dissension arose among Christian factions in and concerning the Holy Land. The Knights Templar were occasionally at odds with the other two Christian military orders, the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, and decades of internal feuds weakened Christian positions politically and militarily. After the Templars were involved in several unsuccessful campaigns, including the pivotal Battle of the Horns of Hattin, Jerusalem was captured by Saladin's forces in 1187. The Templars were forced to relocate their headquarters to other cities in the north, such as the seaport of Acre, which they held for the next century. With the order's military mission now less important, support for the organization began to decline. The Templars were taken by surprise when Philip IV's officers came for them in the early morning hours of Friday the 13th in October 1307. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and the rest of the Templars were arrested simultaneously throughout Europe. About 2,000 men in all, from the knights down to the agricultural workers and the household servants. The arrests were made in the name of the Inquisition, and the Templars were all brought to Paris, where they were imprisoned in their own headquarters. The Templars were charged with numerous offenses, including heresy, obscene rituals, financial corruption, fraud, and secrecy. Many of the accused confessed to the charges under torture. As for the leaders of the order, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, who had confessed under torture, retracted his confession. Godfrey de Charny also retracted his confession and insisted on his innocence. Both men were declared guilty of being relapsed heretics and were sentenced to burn alive at the stake in Paris on the 18th of March, 1314. De Molay reportedly remained defiant till the end, asking to be tied in such a way that he could face the Notre Dame Cathedral and hold his hands together in prayer. According to legend, he called out from the flames consuming him that both Pope Clement and King Philip would soon meet him before God. Pope Clement died only a month later, and King Philip died in a hunting accident before the end of the year, making de Molay's revelation a reality. On the night before his execution, Jacques de Molay was said to have ordered a group of Templars who were still at large to enter into the crypt of the Paris Temple and make off with the treasures of the Templars, which included money, documents, and relics such as the seven-branched calandreba, the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and a shroud. These were taken to the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, from where 18 Templar ships made their escape to the Isle of Mull off the coast of Scotland. It was at this time in history that the Knights Templar began to fade from records, went underground, and legends and myths are all that remain for the centuries to come. One of the enduring legends was that after the suppression of the Knights Templar in France and elsewhere throughout Europe, the Templars gave their support to Robert the Bruce during his War of Independence against the English in the Battle of Bannockburn on June 24, 1314. It is said that when the battle stood in danger of being lost, a force of knights dressed in white robes, bearing a red cross, charged against the English at the decisive moment and gave the victory to the Scots and Robert the Bruce. In return for their critical intervention, a grateful Robert the Bruce was said to have rewarded the Knights Templar by creating Freemasonry. This would have allowed them to continue conducting their affairs with a new outward appearance. Stonemasons. At a time when most workers were tied to the land, Masons were freelancers who sought work where they could. And in Scotland and England during the Middle Ages, they began to form themselves into mutual help associations. There were two kinds of Masons: the rough Mason, who worked in hard stone, laying the foundations and raising the walls, and the more mobile Mason, who carved the fine facades on cathedrals from softer stone. Freestone, as it was called. And these elite Masons were called Freestone Masons, or Freemasons for short. The efficacy of these Freemasons, mutual assistance associations, depended on their exclusivity, that they should be clubs open to Freemasons only. And the point was made by developing a system of signs and rituals supposedly passed down from ancient times and by means of which adherents gained access to the private meetings. Stonemasonry is one of the earliest trades in civilization's history. The ancients heavily relied on stonemasons to build the most impressive and long-lasting monuments to their civilizations. The Egyptians built their pyramids. The civilizations of Central America had their step pyramids, and the Persians their palaces, the Greeks their temples, and the Romans their public works and wonders. Medieval stonemason skills were in high demand, and members of the guild gave rise to three classes of stonemasons: apprentices, journeymen, and master masons. Apprentices were indentured to their masters as the price for their training. Journeymen had a higher level of skill and could go on journeys to assist their masters, and master masons were considered free men who could travel as they wished to work on the projects of the patrons. During the Renaissance, the stonemason guilds admitted members who were not stonemasons and eventually evolved into the Society of Freemasons. The St Clares of Roslin. The St Clares of Roslin were real people who, through coincidence or unspoken purpose, walked in and out of the affairs of the Knights Templar and Freemasons for many generations. They were involved from the time the first Templar Grand Master rode his horse into Scotland in the 12th century, and they remained so until the Mason Grand Lodge of Scotland was formed in 1736, with a St Clare as its first Grand Master. Henry St Clare was at most 16 years old when he became the second Baron of Roslin. 9 years later, he was an experienced knight when the First Crusade was mounted by Pope Urban II in 1096. Minor knights, such as himself, did not receive prominent billing in the historic records of the Crusades, so we do not know much about his service in the Holy Land, other than he had may have fought in the siege of Antioch. However, it is worthy of note that these were the same campaigns in which Hugh of Payens and other founders of the Knights Templar fought. It is therefore possible that they could have known them or even served alongside the knights who would one day wear the white rose and a large red cross of the Templars. Henry St Clare, like most knights who went onto the Crusades, did not stay in the Holy Land after the 3 long and bloody years of the battle that finally won the walled city of Jerusalem. He returned home to the green hills of Roslin and to serve the service of Scotland. Then, in 1128, Hugh de Payens came to Scotland, seeking knights and support for his newly formed order of the Knights Templar. Among the grants he received was the land of Ballandrock, to be used as a Templar headquarters in Scotland. Some sources have suggested that this land was granted to de Payens by Henry St Clare himself. The Templar land of Ballandrock, today known as the town of the Temple, was only 4 miles to the east of Roslin Castle. Being that both de Payens and St Clare had both served in the Crusades and now owned neighboring estates, they could have easily built strong ties. In the first month after the Templars were persecuted, it is highly likely that the St Clares would have provided the Knights Templar shelter. Upon the passing of Henry St Clare in 1420, his son William took the reins of the family as the 3rd Earl of Ormkey and the 11th Baron of Roslin, with an impressive castle as his family seat and a vast resources flowing to him that could be spent as he willed. William St Clare resolved to build a magnificent church unequaled for its beauty in Scotland. He recruited the best masons he could find and brought them to Roslin, and the Roslin Chapel, or the Collegiate Chapel of St Matthew, was dedicated in 1450. For decades, the work continued under St Clare's supervision, being only a short walk up from his castle. With loving attention to each detail, the vastly ornate stonework spread throughout the church. The St Clare men lived their lives so steeped in the honor and duties of knighthood that they refused coffins of burial, but instead they insisted upon being placed beneath the Roslin Chapel, clad in full armor. This recalled the exceptional devotion, even unto death, of the Knights Templar. The mystical lore inspired by the rites of the St. Clares led people to say that the chapel seemed to be awash with flames whenever a St. Clare died. William St. Clare, the 19th Baron of Roslin and descendant of the St. Clare bloodline, had woven himself so deeply into the social fabric of Scotland that when the Masons gathered at Edinburgh in 1736 to form a Grand Lodge of Scotland, he was the resounding choice to be the Grand Master. In doing so, he formally declared that he was giving up any previous hereditary rights to the position of Grand Master, which may have existed for his family. In return, he accepted election to that same position in the newly formed Grand Lodge. Bernard of Clairvaux described the Templars as men whose bodies were protected by iron and whose souls were clothed in the breastplate of faith. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars were seen as paragons of faith, and there was no suggesting that impurity had touched their souls. Within a century of their founding, Templars had entered into the Western imagination as the ideal of chivalry and the guardians of the Holy Grail. Many of the Templar legends are connected with the order's early occupation of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and includes speculation about relics the Templars may have found there. Some of the relics include the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, a piece of the true cross that Jesus was crucified on, the Shroud of Turin, and the Holy Lance, which was said to have pierced the side of Jesus as he hung from the cross. No one knows with certainty how or when the Masonic fraternity was formed. A widely accepted theory among Masonic scholars is that it arose from the stonemason guilds during the Middle Ages. The language and symbols used in the fraternity's rituals come from this era. The oldest document that makes reference to Masons is the Regis Poem, printed about 1390, which was a copy of an earlier work. In 1717, 4 lodges in London formed the first Grand Lodge of England, and records from that point on are more complete. Within 30 years, the fraternity had spread through the American colonies. Freemasonry became very popular in colonial America. George Washington was a Mason. Ben Franklin served as the head of the fraternity in Pennsylvania, as did Paul Revere and Joseph Warren in Massachusetts. Other well-known Masons involved with the founding of America included John Hancock, John Sullivan, Marquis de Lafayette, Baron Frederick von Steuben, Nathaniel Greene, and John Paul Jones. Another Mason, Chief Justice John Marshall, shaped the Supreme Court into its present form. Over the centuries, Freemasonry had developed into a worldwide fraternity, emphasizing personal study, self-improvement, and social betterment via individual involvement and philanthropy. During the late 1700s, it was one of the organizations most responsible for spreading the ideals of the Enlightenment, the dignity of man and the liberty of the individual, the right of all persons to worship as they choose, the formation of democratic governments, and the importance of public education. Masons supported the first public schools in both Europe and America. During the 1800s and early 1900s, Freemasonry grew dramatically. At that time, the government had provided no social safety net. The Masonic tradition of founding orphanages, homes for widows, and homes for the aged provided the only security many people knew. Today, in North America, the Masonic fraternity continues this tradition by giving almost $1.5 million each day to causes that range from operating children's hospitals, providing treatment for childhood language disorders, treating eye disease, funding medical research, contributing to local community service, and providing care to Masons and their families at Masonic homes. The 4 million Masons worldwide continue to help men and women face the problems of the 21st century by building bridges of brotherhood and instilling in the hearts of men ideals for a better tomorrow. Thank you, and this presentation was written and put together by Dave Van Pelt from St. John's Lodge in Mountain Lakes. Thank you.